My dad and my uncle go searching for gold for a few weeks every summer at a cabin they share in the north of Canada. They never found anything. Sometimes they would come back with shed antlers, but that was about as interesting as it got. I think they both knew there wasn't any gold left in that river, but they used to go out there with my grandpa every year, and since he's passed on, I think they do it now to remember him. I finally convinced them to take me one summer. I was 13 and seemingly old enough to not be annoying. We were supposed to be gone for 3 weeks. The cabin was incredibly remote. We couldn't drive to it. We had to charter a float plane. That was the scariest part for me. The pilot drops you off and says he'll pick you up at such and such date, and that's that. He just leaves you there. This was the mid-80s, so we didn't have cell phones or GPS locator beacons. I think if you got appendicitis or something out here, you'd just die. I don't know if my dad or my uncle ever thought of that or not. We packed in enough food to last us the 3 weeks and started our hike in to the cabin. The float plane disappeared into the distance, and I realized just how alone we were out here. The cabin was maybe 5 or 6 miles from where we were dropped off, but since we had to carry everything in, it felt much longer. The cabin sounded much more exciting when my dad and uncle would talk about it. When I got there, I realized it was basically one room with a dirt floor. There was an outhouse about 30 yards away from the cabin and a food cache about 30 yards in the other direction. The cache was raised up off the ground to deter bears and other scavengers that might want to break into the cabin if we left food in there. So that meant every time you wanted something to eat, you had to climb the ladder and get your food from the cache. I was beginning to realize that I was woefully unprepared for this. I also realized that there was more hiking and fishing than there was panning for gold. Everything went fine for the first 2 weeks. Of course, we didn't manage to find any gold at all. In fact, of the 3 of us, I was probably the one who spent the most time trying to find it. My dad and his brother mostly fished. It was on the 3rd and final week that we had our encounter. Looking back, there were definitely signs of them from the first day we arrived, but none of us paid too much attention. Rustling outside the cabin at night, that definitely wasn't the wind. Human footprints and shoes without tread by the edge of the river. My dad noticed them when we got off the plane. His explanation was that there must have been some hikers come through a few days before, but the pilot hadn't heard anything about a hiking party, and he was one of the few pilots that took people to this area. And like I said, the only way to get here is by float plane. We had 4 days before the pilot was scheduled to pick us up. We were all sitting outside the cabin, eating trout we had caught that day, when we noticed smoke coming from the other side of the river. It hadn't been a particularly dry summer, but my dad's first thought was a wildfire. Hopefully, it wouldn't cross the river, because if it did, we were totally screwed. We sat and watched the fire for a while, when we realized it wasn't a wildfire at all. It was a campfire directly across from ours. My uncle pulled out his binoculars and tried to get a look at the campers, but he couldn't see their faces, but he could make out their silhouettes. He said that there was at least a dozen of them, but they stayed close enough to the trees to hide in the shadows. We barricaded the door that night, and it was a good thing we did. It was close to midnight when they approached the cabin. We could hear them moving around outside. They were speaking to each other in a language I didn't understand. I sat in the center of the room with my dad and my uncle. I watched the door handle move, but the barricade stopped it from opening. My uncle yelled at them through the window, but they just got louder. They were screaming and yelling now. I don't know what they were saying, but I knew it wasn't good. My uncle cracked open the window and shot a signal flare toward the voices. And then we felt something hit the door, hard, and then it hit the walls of the cabin. My dad grabbed the shotgun that we kept for bear defense. He yelled out that he had a gun and would use it if they didn't leave. The cabin was hit another time, and my dad pointed the shotgun straight at the door and fired. I didn't know if he hit anything, but the voices became quiet. None of us dared not go outside, so we just sat together in the center of the cabin until the morning. My dad faced the door with the shotgun. We waited for the sun before any of us stepped outside. Of course, they told me to stay in the cabin, but I didn't listen. I thought there would be a dead body out there, but there was nothing. No sign of them at all. But I did find out what was hitting the cabin so hard. There were arrows lodged in the door and the walls. They were primitively made, stone arrowheads, wooden shafts. The feathers looked to be turkey. They were attached to the arrow shaft, and what looked like to be some type of plant or grass wrapped around them. None of us knew what to think. They didn't come back the next night. In fact, we watched their camp move away from us by the smoke from their fire. They looked to be moving into the mountains. There were no trails in those mountains. They were too remote for hikers. I never found out who those people were, or if they were even people. I never saw them, so I can't say for sure, but it was the last time I went to that cabin. I only ever saw it when I was drinking. That's why no one believes me. I'm 6 months sober now. I can still promise you, without a doubt in my body, that that thing I saw was real. I didn't imagine it. Despite the insistence of the police, the doctors, and my partners in sobriety, I know the truth. I just needed someone to listen to it. Can you do that for me? Can you listen? 3 years ago, I was at my bottom. I stayed on that bottom for a long time. I'm still climbing out of it, I think. I lost my job. My personal life crumbled. My pride and my confidence were blown away by the wind. I found comfort where I shouldn't have. The alcohol didn't numb the pain. It didn't make me forget. It just gave me something else to swallow. It was easier to focus on digesting the wet heat in my stomach than it would have been to digest the fragile life I found myself in. Then it came knocking. Its long, bony fingers came rapping at my window. Faint at first, like the brush of a few tree branches against a glass pane. It lured me closer. I looked out, and I saw nothing. It wasn't ready to show itself yet, I suppose. But I felt it. I felt its presence the same way you feel comfortable sitting in a quiet room with your best friend. It felt familiar, and I wanted to feel it again. The next time it knocked, only a few days later, it was louder. This time, I flung the window open and leaned my head into the darkness. I watched its moon-colored skin disappear into the night. "Hello," I called. I didn't know what I was speaking to. I didn't know what it looked like or what it wanted. For the time being, it was simply my pale friend. It was the only friend I had that night, and when it came back, again, only a few days later, I was eager to build upon that friendship. This time, it slammed into my window. I jumped at first. I stared nervously, sweating in my shorts and tank top. That was the first time I wondered how it viewed me. If it looked at me with the bottle in my hand, like a friend, or like an enemy. The anxiety passed, and I approached the window. The comfort was back, you see, and this time when I opened it, I watched its sparkling eyes blink just out of sight. It was my friend, I told myself. I kept drinking, and I kept waiting. The world was falling apart around me. What else did I have to do? Who else did I have to wait for? I left the window open. Eventually, it came back. It didn't need to knock. It let itself right in. I watched it from the nearest room as its long, claw-like fingers coiled around the windowsill. I watched those fingers carve into the wood like it was hot butter. The bottle in my hand couldn't have been full enough to make me brave in that moment. I trembled, but I couldn't look away. This was the friend I had been waiting for. It was a monster. It just pulled itself into my home. Its bald head passed the threshold next. Its ears were small and almost nodded to its head. It looked scared somehow. It looked the way that I felt. Its body was thin and gangly, emaciated, starving. I could count its ribs with ease. There were too many. When the creature's legs slinked through the window and it finally stood up to look at me, I cried. I screamed, I think. I didn't run or fight. I wept, and my friend did not approve of that greeting. It recoiled in horror, as if offended by my outburst. It slammed its arms and elbows into my wall. I watched picture frames hit the floor, and I heard the glass shatter. It rakes its nail-like fingers across the carpet, tearing up staples and foam padding. It crushed the table and turned my couch into confetti. But it never came for me. It never turned the violence toward me, although I feared constantly that it would. Instead, it destroyed everything around me. It opened its mouth, and when it tried to scream back, it yelled in my own voice. It was mimicking me. It was taunting me for the disaster that I'd become. It was showing me true destruction. It humbled me for thinking my grief was at all significant when terrible things like this lurked in the world. It faded away after that. It skirted back out the window, disappearing once more into the dark. All my friend left me was a mess. I cleaned what I could, bumped and scraped myself in my stupor. When the police arrived, well, you know what they thought. A drunken hallucination or a fantastic story to absolve myself of any responsibility. Neither of those things were true. I didn't carve the imprint of the creature's hands into my wall. I didn't destroy my house. Not when it was the only thing I had left. I welcomed their help though. I needed it. I needed the doctors, and I needed the group that would convince me to sober up. They don't know that I stopped drinking just to keep it away. I don't want to hear that knocking ever again. I don't want the beast to know that I'm vulnerable and come once more to take advantage. I need friends, not monsters. I just wish that my friends would believe me. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a creature at home in the darkness who tried to find a new home. I was a botanist. Now, of course, I think it's a rather fascinating subject, but I won't kid myself. Studying plants puts most people to sleep. There's still a lot to learn out there. There are new species of plants and fungi being discovered every year. However, I never imagined I'd ever run into anything quite like this. I had just relocated back to Canada after doing a 2-year field study in the Yukon. I took a position at a lab in Alberta. I was there maybe 6 weeks at the time that this happened. A scientist I had not yet met pulled me off my project to examine some of their latest field samples. I took a look at the samples. Most of them were specimens from tropical and subtropical plants. Nothing too out of the ordinary. I took a quick look at the soil they had brought back, and it was extremely acidic. My best guess was that it was taken from a location high in geothermal activity. But like I said, the plants they had me look at were ordinary tropical plants. No new species, no oddities. That is, until I learned the location that they were sourced. I should make note that the original information was hidden from me. I'm certain I wasn't meant to see it. I wanted to talk to the scientist who had me looking at these plants. He had a private lab on the premises. I went looking for him, assuming that he was in his lab. The lab was dark, but the door wasn't locked, so I went in. I really wasn't intending to snoop through his things. The file was lying right on top of his desk. I found the field notes and the locations of the samples. It didn't make any sense. They were from the Northwest Territories, specifically Nahanni National Park Reserve. That means there is an Arctic rainforest somewhere up near the Yukon. And judging from the soil samples, it is being warmed by geothermal activity. If the GPS coordinates on the notes are correct, this is a huge find. I read the rest of the notes as quickly as I could. I was certain that this file was not for my eyes to see, and I didn't want to linger in this guy's private lab any longer than I needed to. The Arctic rainforest was plausible to me after seeing the samples myself, but some of the other things in the file were things I had a hard time believing. After escaping the lab seemingly without incident, I took to researching the Nahanni Valley. It's nearly impossible to get to without a float plane and is arguably one of the most remote wilderness areas of the world. But there's more. There's a trove of myth and legends coming out of that place. I'm not one to put much stocks into stories like that. It seems like there's always this logical explanation at the bottom of it, but there might be something to it, at least some of the stories. The rest of what I read in the scientist's field notes were nothing short of bizarre. Like I said, I could get on board with the rainforest. If there was enough geothermal activity to warm the valley year-round, it is plausible that the tropical flora could survive, even thrive in such an environment, provided it was protected somehow from the harsh tundra biome around it. I really don't know how to say this next part without sounding insane, but I'll give it my best shot. The field notes in the file claimed to have observed megafauna in the valley, and from their descriptions, I'd say ancient megafauna. Think of creatures like mammoths, short-faced bears, dire wolves. But it gets even stranger. I noticed a drawing that one of the scientists made. It appeared to be a large, winged reptile. The notes with it gave 3 different GPS coordinates, all in the northern section of the Nahanni Valley. The notes also stated that it had colorful feathers, a lizard-like head, and a creature that appeared aggressive towards humans. I was dumbfounded. This was a dinosaur, a living dinosaur. Imagine a tropical oasis in the middle of a tundra where actual dinosaurs still exist. Imagine what other species could be living there. I had to know more. I ran into the scientists later that day and tried to press him for more information without letting on that I knew what was in that file of his. I asked where the samples were taken from, but he ignored the question. I then asked if there would be any options for field studies in the near future, because I would like to be involved in the next one. I was new at the lab, so it wasn't an odd question, but he just said he didn't know. I think he knew that I found his file. He took me out to lunch a few days later, and I noticed the information I had recorded about the plants from the Nahanni was scrubbed from my computer when I returned. I couldn't exactly ask him about it either, because then I would have to admit to snooping through his files. And to be honest, I was afraid of what might happen to me if anyone found out for sure that I knew. It's been quite a few years since that incident. I'm retired now, and that other scientist was quite a number of years older than me, so I feel like it's a good time to tell this story. I've been contemplating visiting the Nahanni Valley for years now, but the Parks Canada has limited the amount of parks open to the public, and not surprisingly, the area I'd like to go to has been closed off. Maybe it's for the best, but God, do I wonder what's out there.